Hi all, welcome to educators.com. I'm Harish, software engineer. In this session, we will learn about the prototype and the difference between the own properties and the prototype properties. So by end of this session, you should be able to understand like why we need prototype and how effectively we can use the prototype and what's the difference between the own properties and the prototype properties. So let's start with the prototype. The functions in JavaScript are objects and they contain methods and properties. So in JavaScript, the functions are objects. So apart from the existing object predefined objects, so whatever be the function you define and which will be used within your application, those are all considered as objects in JavaScript. Like addition of two numbers or the return, printing something to the console or anything, whatever it might be, it will be considered as an object. And why we consider object and how we make sure that this function is an object, because it contains some of the methods like apply and call and the properties like length, constructor and the prototype property. As you can check that the apply call methods are used to execute the function in the with the current context, and the length property returns a number of arguments passed to this function, and the constructor property will point to the function definition itself. Whereas prototype is also a property which is been created when we define the function, similar to the properties like apply, call, length and constructor. So the initial value of this prototype is an empty object. So when you check the prototype type of with using the type of keyword, it will return the object string. Okay, so we can add the methods and properties to the object using the this keyword within the function constructor. Like as you can check in the I've mentioned in the object construct um, objects presentation that we can define the objects using the constructor function also. In that we are using this keyword. Okay, so using this keyword we are able to add the properties and methods to the objects. So apart from that way of adding the properties and methods, there is also an other way to add the methods and properties. The other way is using the prototype property. So here you can check that we have defined a details constructor which will accept two parameters called first name and last name, and inside the function constructor we are creating three properties: first name and last name, which will contain the values of the arguments, and then the full name, which will return the concatenated value of the first name and last name properties. So as I mentioned before that when you use this full name methods within the constructor, those will be created each and every time. Okay, so instead of doing that we can directly assign that value to the details prototype property. Okay, so you can assign in this way, like here I have assigned the details to prototype is equal to date of birth, nationality and get info method. So the prototype object contains three properties, two are the values and the other is a method. So this is how we can assign the prototype object to an existing object. And since prototype is also an object, we are assigning this object as a property value for a prototype property. Okay, so home properties versus prototype properties. Properties that are added to the prototype are directly available as soon as we create a new object using constructor. So here you can check that We have defined a details constructor and then its prototype. So when you create this object using this constructor, the prototype properties will be available. So when you access this dot .tob, this dot nationality, those properties will be accessible and will be referring the prototype properties. Okay. So prototype is not copied with every new object instance. This is the main point actually. So when you create a new object, each and every time we will be having a reference to a new object. But whereas coming to prototype, it will not create a new object each and every time. So prototype is not copied at all. It will be returning the reference each and every time. So by this what happens actually? So when you make changes to the prototype at any level, it will be inherited by all the objects. This means that the objects which are created based on the constructor that has this prototype will see these changes. And one more important thing is we can add properties to the prototype at any time. That means let's say you have defined a constructor and the prototype, as you can see is similar to this example, and then you created a 5 objects of this constructor, and then you added a new property for this prototype saying prototype dot some x values property is equal to value. So when you create this property, those property will also be accessible by the previously created objects. Why? Because we are passing the prototype as a reference, not as a value. So that's the reason. Whatever be you assign or whatever be the property you create or anything you do with the prototype, those changes will be updated for each and every object. Okay. I mean, these changes will not be notified for each and for each and every object. Those objects can see those changes when they have the access the property or anything. They can see those changes. Okay. When there is a property with same name as in prototype, the home property takes precedence over the prototypes. So what does this mean? Here in this example, you can check that we have defined a first name property in the details constructor. When you define this same property in the prototype, and then when you create an object of this constructor, and then when you use the first name property, it will first reference the constructor property, not the prototype property. Okay. So when you don't have the constructor property, it will go for the prototype property. So first object home properties will be taking the preference, and then the prototype properties. Okay. When there is a so how you will know whether an object is a prototype of this constructor or not? We have a method called isPrototype of in JavaScript, which will allow us to know whether an object is a prototype of a constructor or not. So when you use this method, it will return as true if this is a prototype. Like let's say x is a prototype of y, then it will return the true, or else it will return as false. Okay. Let's flip to brackets IO. Here, first let's define a function constructor that will accept 2 arguments called first name and last name. Let's try to assign the argument values to the properties of this object. This dot last name, And let's try to create a method also which will return the concatenated value of this first name and last name. Okay, so return this dot first name plus this dot, so let's add a space between the both, and this dot last name. Okay, so now let's try to create an object based on this constructor. Name of details will, and then Smith. And now let's try to print the log of this full name. Okay, so first details dot get, sorry, full name. So let's check the output. So here you can check that it has printed the value as Will and Smith. So it has printed the value returned by the full name method. So now let's try to create the prototype for this constructor. Details dot prototype equal to, and the prototype will be the object as usual, and it will have some explicit properties like date of birth. Okay, let's try to make it, yeah, and then a nationality property which will contain the values Indian, and then a get info method which will return this values, date of birth plus this dot date of birth, and then plus, let's try to print also this nationality, and this plus this dot nationality. Okay, so now let's try to print the get info, that means which will return the date of birth and nationality. So here in the console you can check that it has printed the values of date of birth and nationality properties related to the prototype. Now let's try to create one more object of this details constructor. Let's try to name this object as second details, which will have the John Cena as the values. Okay, now let's try to get the values. So here it also prints the same values. Now let's try to update the prototype. So details dot prototype dot date of birth, let's say 15 12 2000. Okay, now let's try to print this first details and the second details date of birth. As here you can check that it has printed the value as 15/12/2007 for the date of birth. So by this you can see that whatever be the property change within the prototype, it will affect all the objects which are dependencies. Okay, So here you can check that we have changed the date of birth value, but when we change the value it has affected the first details as well as the second details. So this is how the prototype works in the JavaScript. But if you define a property on yourself, like let's say if you assign the first details dot date of birth equals to let's say some 23/12/2009. Okay, so let's try to print this. So here you can check that it has not printed the value of prototype for the first details object. Why? Because when you assign the value to the property, it will recreate the property for that object. So it is like shadowing over the prototype. So when you have a property for a given object, this property will take precedence over the prototype object. Okay, so this is how the prototype works in JavaScript. So by this you can understand that with the help of prototype we can shade the properties across all the objects which are created using this constructor. So that's the one important thing and usage of this prototype. And one more thing here, let's try to add a property to the prototype saying residence or city. Okay, and let's make it as Hyderabad. And now let's try to print the city of the second details. See, here it has printed the second Hyderabad value. So even when you created an object and then you added a new property to prototype, even that will affect. So this updated changes to the prototype object will be reflected across all the objects which are created using this constructor. Okay, so this is how the prototype works in JavaScript. So that's all from this session. Thank you.